scrolling through social media, there are lots of people offering secrets to make money quick.
If you're gonna make it, you need the right mindset. If you're not thinking big, you're not.
They've come from Nigerian princes.
Another well-known scheme is one that involves a Nigerian prince. It's been going on since even before the internet was a thing.
In Louisiana, a man under arrest tonight accused in the notorious Nigerian prince email scam.
You know, we always joke about the Nigerian prince. He doesn't exist. He's not going to give you money if you give him your bank account.
But advance fee scams like these still manage to rake in millions of dollars a year. Another popular scam that's just slightly more complicated and way more fun to say.
Pump and dump schemes.
Pump and dump.
Pump and dump.
Pump and dump scheme, which I'm happy to tell you has nothing to do with breastfeeding.
Instead, it works like this. You persuade people to invest in something that's worthless, pumping up its price, and then you dump your stock when it's at its peak. This happens a lot today with cryptocurrency. A schemer will send out a pump signal in a messaging app like Telegram. Insiders rush to buy the coin, boosting the price. Then other people who think it must be a hot stock rush in and buy it too. And then the insiders sell off. The entire cycle takes minutes. And then there's a slower burn rush in pump signal and a pumping up its price.
And dump.
Another popular scam that's just slightly more complicated and way more fun to say.
Pump and dump schemes.
Pump and dump.
Pump and dump.
Pump and dump scheme, which I'm happy to tell you has nothing to do with breastfeeding.
Instead, it works like this. You persuade people to invest in something that's worthless, pumping up its price. And then you dump your stock when it's at its peak. This happens a lot today with cryptocurrency. A schemer will send out a pump signal in a messaging app like Telegram. Insiders rush to buy the coin, boosting the price. Then other people who think it must be a hot stock rush in and buy it too. And then the insiders sell off. The entire cycle takes minutes. And then there's a slower burn investment scam that can survive for decades. It's named after Charles Ponzi, an Italian immigrant who back in the 1920s made a fantastic promise. He'd double your money in 90 days, guaranteed. But in reality, he was simply paying early investors with money from new investors. That's how all Ponzi schemes work. It's borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, and then borrowing from Paul to pay Jane, and so on and so on. The only hitch is, if enough of the investors ask for their money back at once, the whole thing collapses. Which is what happened in 2008, when this type of scheme infamously came back into the spotlight.
For decades, Bernie Madoff was able to launder billions of dollars in Ponzi proceeds, essentially through a single set of accounts at JP Morgan.
Apparently, he was purporting to be getting 10, 15% returns on their money when in fact he had lost all of it and pretending to pay off the old people with new people's money.
One of the reasons people trusted him so much was because he was such a pillar of the American Jewish community, and people thought, good old Bernie, he's above suspicion, and it turned out he was a total crook.
Ponzi schemes are known as affiliation scams because they tend to victimize people who have something in common, such as religion or ethnic identity, with the scammer.
Ponzi schemes often get confused with pyramid schemes, but they're different. Here, you don't borrow from Peter to pay Paul. You pay Peter if he convinces Paul to join your scheme. And then if Paul brings in Jane, both Peter and Paul get a cut. And so on and so on. Multi-level marketing companies also rely on recruitment. You may have seen friends online trying to sell you products and recruit you to also sell those products. But MLMs are legitimate businesses as long as most of the money comes from outside customers buying their products. Pyramid schemes aren't. Their products are pretty worthless, so most of the money comes from recruitment. And when the scheme runs out of new people to recruit, then the whole thing collapses. And then there's a final category, coaching schemes. They're similar to advanced fee schemes, but instead of paying money for the promise of money, you pay money for knowledge that they promise will make you money.
Wouldn't you like to learn how to make a fortune in real estate without needing any money?
Except the promises are false. The money-making programs largely don't deliver. And you're often lured into paying for progressively more expensive classes because they're great salesmen who use every tactic in the book, starting with that fantastic promise.
I assure you, it's very real and actually pretty easy to do if you just follow my system step by step.
They have compelling rags to riches stories.
Jeff, seeing how your life is now, it's hard to believe that before you discovered your shortcuts, you were dead broke living in your sister-in-law's basement.
Testimonials from supposedly happy customers.
Using just one of Jeff Paul's shortcuts, I'm currently making over $250,000 a year.
And they create a sense of urgency.
You have to get moving because I'm only looking for a few people, few motivated people, hardworking people in your area.
All of these kinds of schemes rely on similar tactics, and they all tend to thrive at certain moments of change. At the time Gregor McGregor made up Poyet's, London was in the grips of a great speculative flurry. People were getting rich on all kinds of new hot things, including countries. All these nations just declared independence. It wasn't a stretch to think Poyet's may be among them.
So you have con artists throughout history who come up during wars or pandemics or different things that are scary and new or exciting and new. That's when con artists can actually swoop in and give you the stories that you want to believe in, give you the truth that you want to be the truth.
And technology has made that easier and easier.
The railroad, the telegraph, eventually the telephone, the airplane, enabled people to interact with each other, not only across entire countries, but also across continents. How do you evaluate people that you've never met? All of that makes trust more important. All of it makes fraud more possible, actually, and also potentially more harmful.
But it wasn't the railroad or the telegraph that opened the floodgates for scams. It was another innovation that came in the 80s.
VacuFresh is so airtight, even water can't seep in.
The Ginsu can cut a slice of bread so thin you can almost see through it.
Don't delay. In previous years, both Ski Locker and Rockies have sold fast.
Infomercials have been a thing since the 40s.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you order right now...
But the format really took off with the rise of cable TV.
Hey, how many of you would like to be a millionaire? Raise your hand.
And that created a vast array of new channels that operated late into the night. For scammers, the costs of entry were reduced. And the thing about fraud and scams is you don't need everybody to bite. You just need enough people.
And then the cost of entry fell through the floor.
With the internet age, it becomes much easier to just cast a wide net. And so people who wouldn't necessarily succeed in a world where the barrier to entry was higher can make a go of it here. So I think there are more petty con artists.
Online, scammers took advantage of every new thing. Email, of course. That's the reason we have spam folders. When internet marketing became a thing, a new crop of schemes promised to teach you how to make millions online. And then social media gave scammers a whole new way to reach audiences. Then Amazon came along, and scammers spawned a new kind of coaching scheme, teaching you how to buy products cheap and then sell them for profit. And as cryptocurrency took off, so did new coins that, in the words of the FBI, were of a Ponzi-type nature.
The world is not anymore the way it used to be. No. Be connected!
We say, oh, am I going to be, that old fuddy-duddy who didn't take advantage of this great opportunity?
And get-rich-quick schemes today are using the exact same tactics they used 200 years ago. On June 11, 2016, Dr. Ruja Ignatova arrived in London with an opportunity of a lifetime.
This network was created to become and to fuel the growth of OneCoin, which I strongly believe will be the #1 cryptocurrency worldwide.
OneCoin was supposed to be faster, cheaper, and more secure. It was meant to be
the Bitcoin killer.
And there was urgency.
We're moving into a huge phase 2 now. Whatever coins you have on your account or in the mining, we will double the coins on your account.
And she tricked other people into promoting it for her.
We wish you successful, and then you will see what dreams may come.
OneCoin offices sprung up around the globe, and it spread like wildfire. People from some 175 countries poured more than $4 billion into this exciting new cryptocurrency between 2015 and 2017. But when the day came when people would be able to turn OneCoin into cash and become rich beyond their wildest dreams, Ruja was nowhere to be found. The crypto queen vanished into thin air. She made the whole thing up. And the remarkable thing is, there were so many warning signs. In 2015, a cryptocurrency blog called OneCoin a scam. A year later, so did Norway's Direct Selling Association, as did Italy's Antitrust Authority and the Hungarian Central Bank. But to many investors, those warnings didn't matter, thanks to another tactic. Insist your scam is definitely not a scam.
We get criticized so much. We are a network marketing company. We're not a real cryptocurrency or whatever I hear out there. We will say to the regulators that we are the most transparent, most powerful, and most legal cryptocurrency out there.
In 2019, federal prosecutors pressed charges against Ruja and several employees. The case against Ruja is ongoing. But Ruja's brother, who took over OneCoin after she disappeared, pleaded guilty to fraud and money laundering charges. And yet, almost 20,000 people signed this petition. Victims of fraud process it in different ways. On Facebook, there's a OneCoin victim support group that has almost 3,000 members. Founded by Jen McAdam, she convinced her family and friends to invest nearly €250,000. And like many fraud victims, she blames herself.
Since realising that it was a scam, the regret, the shame, the guilt, it never leaves. You live with that daily.
We'll never know the true number of people hurt by OneCoin. 40% of fraud victims don't tell anybody, not even their friends or family, and only 20% report it to authorities. But these are just estimates. You can't measure reports that don't exist.
Some consumers feel as though if they're not going to get their money back, why bother to file a complaint? And I tell them the way that these people are apprehended is because you took the time to file a complaint. The information that you provide can help law enforcement locate the scammers.
You can go to these websites. And then in the US, it works like this.
When a consumer files a complaint, the complaint is then forwarded mainly to Federal Trade Commission. And the Federal Trade Commission have a database. The database detects patterns of fraud. then it will point out to law enforcement, this is where these scammers are most likely located.
A court found that this guy engaged in false advertising, and this guy, and this one. And Bernie Madoff is serving 150 years behind bars. But
law enforcement do not have enough manpower to go after each and every scam.
It's one of the reasons why it's often very difficult to prosecute people for fraud. The evidence often cuts more than one way. The issue often turns on the intent.
And just because there are laws against false advertising, that doesn't mean you can't embellish. It's called puffery. It can be acceptable to exaggerate as long as you keep it vague and subjective, or can claim no reasonable buyer would take it seriously.
It's often really hard to tell where the scam ends and puffery begins. But a better way to put it, it's really hard to tell where puffery ends and fraud begins.
All of these tactics are just marketing 101. And simply losing money on a program that promised to make you rich doesn't make it a fraud. In fact, a study of hundreds of legitimate multi-level marketing companies found that workers actually lost money. And online, dozens of financial gurus, hundreds of legitimate multi-level marketing companies losing money on.
Better way to put it, it's really hard to tell where puffery ends and fraud begins.
All of these tactics are just marketing 101. And simply losing money on a program that promised to make you rich doesn't make it a fraud. In fact, a study of hundreds of legitimate multi-level marketing companies found that workers actually lost money. Doesn't make it a fraud. In fact, a study of hundreds of legitimate multi-level marketing companies found that workers actually lost money. And online, dozens of financial gurus promise to teach you how to get rich using familiar tactics.
And here's what's so fucking amazing. It means you can make an incredible income without ever creating a single product, running a single ad, and cold calling a single person. That deserves a round of applause.
I've been able to make the transition from working a corporate job to working for myself from anywhere and being able to make millions of dollars per year doing that.
Two guys that I trained starting 1 year ago, and they were making under $5 grand a month 1 year ago. Now they're making $210,000 a year drop shipping on Facebook.
Some of their customers say that they've lost money or the money-making programs don't deliver. But as of 2020, none of those gurus have been charged with fraud.
It's just really sometimes hard to identify the well-meaning, confident entrepreneur from the scoundrel.
When people ask me, are there specific types of people who fall for con artists, does it have to do with intelligence? Does it have to do with education? Does it have to do with gullibility? It turns out that the answer is no.
Some studies show that seniors are more susceptible to scams. Others found that they are less likely to fall for one.
I spend a lot of time trying to find common characteristics, and they don't exist.
Everybody, even myself, everyone is susceptible to becoming a victim of a scam.
James Perry once bought rare coins, supposedly worth millions of dollars, that turned out to be fake.
The joke was on the person whose job it is to prevent people from becoming victims.
Or take Stephen Greenspan. He wrote the book on this. Literally.
The first copy of the book I held in my hand on December 10th, I believe, 2008.
The next day, FBI agents arrested the man to whom he entrusted his savings, Bernie Madoff.
Canadian columnist Robert Fulford wrote that Stephen Greenspan will be remembered as the gullibility expert who forgot to read his own book on gullibility.
Without trust, I mean, where are we as a society? We're nowhere. We can't build societies if we don't trust one another.
And across societies, trust goes hand in hand with prosperity.
Most of the time, you can trust other people. And if you don't then have a basic sense of trust, you're going to be spending an awful lot of time trying to decide whether the person you're talking to is telling you the truth or not. You're going to spend an awful lot of time investigating whether the thing you're about to purchase is the genuine article or not.
Trust may lead us to buy a piece of a fictional paradise, but it also helped us build a world that's closer to paradise than our ancestors could have ever imagined.
One of my favorite quotes about this comes from the late, great Ricky Jay, who was obsessed with con artists. And he said in an interview a number of years before his death that he wouldn't want to live in a world where we couldn't be conned, because that's a world where we don't believe in anyone or anything. And I agree with him. I don't think that's a world worth living in.
In 1958, Fresno, California was growing fast. It had a pretty downtown, a brand new mall, and sprawling suburbs. It was, in short, a pretty ordinary American city, and the perfect site for one of the boldest experiments in capitalism. In September of that year, 60,000 residents received a little rectangle of plastic in the mail, embossed with their names and addresses, a mysterious number, a good through date, and the name Bank Americard.
Imagine opening your mail one day
and addresses. In September of that year, 60,000 residents received a little rectangle of plastic in the mail, embossed with their name on here. In 1958, Fresno, California was growing fast. It had a pretty downtown, a brand new mall, and sprawling suburbs. It was, in short, a pretty ordinary American city, and the perfect site for one of the boldest experiments in capitalism. In September of that year, 60,000 residents received a little rectangle of plastic in the mail, embossed with their names and addresses, a mysterious number, a good through date, and the name Bank Americard.
Imagine opening your mail one day. You've never had a credit card before.
And you're told that this piece of plastic is loaded with $500, over $4,500 in today's money.
You could spend it however you liked. And so credit cards liberated consumers to spend freely in a way that they never had before.
They were sold as the perfect package, luxury and convenience all rolled into one. Pretty soon, millions of people had a Bank Americard, and they loved them. They used their cards to buy all the trappings of middle-class life. But many of them didn't pay Bank of America back. In the first few years, the bank lost around $15 million. And it was determined not to let that happen again. Today, the industry is worth trillions. And there are thousands of different credit cards and wallets all over the world.
You take MasterCharge, don't you?
MasterCharge, of course.
For decades, credit cards have been marketed as a ticket to a more exciting life.
It's everywhere you want to be, including front row center.
But for many people, the dream they promised has become more of a nightmare. Around 4 in 10 Americans have credit card debt, and 1 in 10 expect that debt to outlive them. So, have credit cards really liberated us? And how can you avoid getting screwed?
Where can the self-respecting family of today turn for aid?
Shopkeepers and customers alike are concerned about spiraling credit. It feels like every month you take 1 step forward but 2 steps back.
It's very difficult to calculate the amount of interest you're being charged on a monthly basis. And of course there's an annual interest rate, a monthly rate, and even a daily rate.
What are we going to do, John? We must have money to meet those overdue grocery and doctor bills.
I don't know, dear, but we'll find some way.
Credit is a simple but radical idea. There's someone with extra money lying around who's willing to lend it, and someone else who needs extra money right now and would be able to pay it back later. Matching them up has always been one of the biggest engines of the economy.
Those who have savings often invest or lend them, hoping for a share of profit.
But that means solving a central dilemma: risk. Credit just means a loan, but it comes from the Latin credere, to trust. Before credit cards, if you needed to buy something big, you'd probably go to your banker and ask for a loan. And they'd judge you on the 3 C's: your capacity to pay back the loan,
Mr. Morton owns a hardware store in town, and he is well known as a capable businessman.
whether you had enough savings to pay it back, or something that could be taken if you didn't,
What collateral can you offer for this loan, Mr. Brown?
and your character.
Since Mr. Morton is known to the bank as a reliable man, the banker can feel reasonably certain that Mr. Morton will be able to repay the loan when it comes due.
It wasn't a very scientific way to judge risk, so mostly the people who got credit were,
quote, men of responsibility,
meaning white and middle class. But then computers came along.
Suddenly, there were vast troves of data available to these banks to try and figure out to whom they should lend.
Banks stopped judging people based on hearsay and started using credit scores, complicated statistical models designed to predict how risky it would be to lend you money.
Some would argue it's not super fair. Some would argue that it's not a true projection, but it's what we've got as a way for banks to, frankly, be able to judge you in a way that they can judge everybody else.
The most used score in the US ranges from 300 to 850. Above 700 means you have good credit, you're trustworthy. But if your score's below 650, you're considered higher risk.
So a good score puts you in the running for some of the best types of credit. It also shows up when you're applying to live somewhere as a renter. Your landlord's gonna wanna check your credit history just to make sure you're gonna be good for the money. These numbers are not just numerals, it characterizes who we are as people.
And the easiest way to get a credit history? Have a credit card. All this data has helped more borrowers get credit. And it's helped creditors make a lot more money off of them.
My name is Elena Botea. I worked at Capital One for 5 years. Credit card companies conduct literally tens of thousands of experiments per year to figure out how do I make the most money from each person.
Which means that each of us is playing a game with slightly different rules.
So there's really two main groups of customers. So you have your transactors and you have your revolvers.
A transactor is someone who pays their bill in full every month. And a revolver is someone who doesn't. If you look at American adults, about 40% are revolvers, 40% are transactors, and the other 20% just don't have a credit card at all. Ideally, you want to be a transactor.
When it comes to managing your credit, boring is best. Pay your bills on time and try not to carry a balance.
Those people oftentimes are getting a great deal on their credit cards, right? So they're getting rewards, maybe some other perks, a little bit of fraud protection.
All while boosting their credit score.
And so those people tend to be very happy with their credit cards.
But the credit card company isn't your teammate. You're playing against them, which is why they're reported to have another name for transactors.
If you pay off your debts, you're a deadbeat from the banker's point of view.
Called deadbeats. That's a deadbeat customer. We're not making any money on them.
Well, that's not entirely true.
Every time you swipe your credit card, there is a processing fee charged to the merchant. And that fee can vary normally from anywhere around a little bit less than 2%, sometimes up to 4%.
If you're a transactor, the credit card company isn't making money off of you. They're making money off your swipes. Just look at the Amex Black Card, a favorite of the rich and famous. In 2014, a Chinese billionaire bought this teacup for $36 million and put it on his Black Card. With an average merchant fee of 3%, Amex may have pocketed over $1 million from just that one sale.
There is a lot of competition in that space. The banks are really fighting over those wealthy customers.
Some have dubbed it the rewards war. And arguably the winner is this, the Chase Sapphire Reserve Card. When it debuted in 2016, it had a sign-up bonus worth $1,500. It was so popular, Chase ran out of the metal they used to make it. And within a few months,
JP Morgan Chase's new Sapphire Reserve credit card will reduce the bank's profit.
Chase is losing $200 million on this card.
The losses are due to the lavish awards offered to entice users to take the cards.
But Chase didn't care.
The card was so successful, it cost us about $200 million, but we expect that to have a good return on it.
More effective.
I wish it was a $400 million loss.
Because that sign-up bonus was a one-time hit. But those customer swipes year after year will send Chase more money than the bank pays out in perks. But there's one type of card user the industry actually loses money on, the hacker.
I personally wouldn't identify myself as a credit card hacker. I would definitely say that I take advantage of all the opportunities that are out there.
All right, guys, ready for Texas.
I stayed at the Bellagio completely for free just because I was using credit cards. I've been able to take flights and stay at hotels that I never thought I would before. The Bahamas, I was in Austin, I was in New York, I was in LA.
Brian is a credit card super user, someone who uses the company's tricks against them to maximize rewards, skirt fees, and never pay interest.
Actively, I would say I have about 13 credit cards at this moment, but under my whole umbrella, I think I have about 20 to 30 plus cards.
Which he keeps in specialized binders.
This one right here is my main one. This one's my backup one. This one is a custom gold card. It's actually 24 karat.
And organizes in a thorough spreadsheet.
So I have 14 cards logged onto my spreadsheet, but about 6 of them require just a little bit more attention. I have 1.5, maybe even 2 million points. When it comes to my credit cards, I use many different ones depending on what type of season it is or what type of category spend that I'm trying to get. It definitely does take a good amount of work to stay on top of these things.
All those perks are partly paid for by merchant fees. It's why sometimes you'll see signs like this. American Express fees are notoriously high. And it's why a lot of places are cash only. They don't want to pay the fees at all. And credit cards don't just cost merchants, they cost consumers. Because stores raise their prices to cover those fees. If you have one of those fancy cards, you earn that back with perks. But if you have a more basic card or pay with a debit card or cash, you're just paying more and subsidizing the fancy card users along the way. One study found that cash users are basically giving each card-using household over $1,000 every year.
What you see is that it really creates this big transfer of wealth from lower income families to higher income families.
And lower income families are more likely to be revolvers, the biggest moneymaker for credit card companies, because of a little thing called interest.
Say you spent $1,000 on a fridge, so it's like a very round number.
When your credit card bill is due, the fridge will cost you exactly that amount. That $1,000 was essentially a free advance, a loan with no interest. But say you can't afford to pay off that fridge. The very next day, that $1,000 you didn't pay starts accruing interest. How much? Well, that depends on your APR, your annual percentage rate. If you have a really good credit score, it could be 12%, but they go as high as 23%.
The average is around 16%, and that amount is going to compound daily. So every day, your balance is going to get a little bit higher, a little bit higher, a little bit higher. then you'll get your statement.
This month, you'll owe an additional $13. But you don't just pay interest on the $1,000 principal. You pay interest on the interest. So every month, your debt will grow a little faster. A month later, you'll owe this much. A year later, you'll owe this much. And if you keep carrying that original $1,000 over, eventually,
you've paid more in interest than the actual amount that you originally borrowed.
There's a reason the Old Testament and the Quran both banned usury, the old-timey word for high interest. Dante even reserved a special portion of hell for usurers. They're in the seventh circle, with the murderers. Interest can be a devilish thing, and American card users have been paying a lot more of it. In 2019, $121 billion, right into the pockets of credit card companies.
Credit card companies don't want people who pay back all their money every month, and they don't want people to never pay back their money. But between those two extremes is the sweet spot, is the place where banks make a lot of money on those loans.
And they've got quite a few tricks to make sure that happens. First, they need you to pick their card. Dropping ready-to-use cards on unsuspecting consumers is now illegal, but companies send out billions of credit card offers every year instead, with enticing deals catered to the kind of customer they think you are. Transactors will get offers for those great perk cards, but if they think you're more likely to be a revolver, they'll send you something like this, a sweet introductory offer, no interest for the first year.
Now, what happens from the consumer psychological standpoint of this is that when I see these rewards offered to me, I start now thinking about three benefits.
Bahamas, I was in completely for free, even 2 million points.
I start thinking about the things I could get, and I stop thinking about the things I have to pay to get those benefits.
Like the amount of money you have to spend to get those rewards, or the high interest rate that'll kick in later. And the credit line they give you? That isn't because they think you're good for that money.
When consumers see some information in front of them, they assume that there's a reason it was put there. And the assumption might be that whoever's making this decision thinks that I'm credit worthy enough that I can have a limit that's this high.
The business model that credit card companies use with the customers with lower credit scores is sometimes called low and grow.
Starting you on a low credit line and then slowly increasing it. Because studies show most people will use that room almost perfectly in tandem. On average, if you double the credit line, you double the debt.
So sometimes consumers are myopic, and what I mean by that is that they have almost tunnel vision. They're focused on today. They're focused on the here and now.
And it's especially easy to overspend with a credit card.
So there's research on what's called the pain of paying. And what it suggests is that different forms of payment can be more or less psychologically painful to make.
One study found that areas of the brain associated with pain and fear are more likely to light up when you watch someone pay with cash than when you watch them pay with a credit card. And once you've racked up a month's worth of charges, you get your first bill. It will probably look something like this. In the top right corner will be your due date, balance, and a minimum payment. It's usually 3% of your total debt, or $25, whichever is higher.
That's there for good reason. It's there so that you know how much you have to pay so you don't default on your credit card. But it may have the impact of anchoring consumers to pay less than they would have otherwise because they get too hooked on that one amount that they see on the statement itself.
It's known as anchoring bias, a tendency our brains have to favor the first piece of information we're offered.
When a ship wants to dock, it drops an anchor in the water, and that holds the ship down. Now, of course, the ship can move back and forth, but it doesn't stray that far from the anchor.
Which is roughly the same thing that happens in our brains when we see a minimum payment.
We sort of stay close by to that number.
If you just paid the minimum on that fridge from before, you would eventually pay it off. But it would take almost 5 years and cost you an extra $400.
They call it the treadmill to nowhere. You're on that minimum balance ride, which only takes off a minuscule amount of your balance every pay period.
U.S. law now requires bills to have one of these, a little box that tells you how much money you might save by paying more each month.
Now, note what's interesting about this is that nobody is actually being encouraged right there on that statement to pay the maximum of what they can. And in fact, research that I and others have done has found that people still end up anchoring on whatever that extra information is. They may end up paying more than the minimum, but they still might pay less than they would pay if none of that information was there to begin with.
And there are lots of other little obstacles credit card companies throw in our way, like long, complicated contracts full of fine print, where they hide all sorts of penalty fees for paying a bill late, transferring your balance to a different card, or using your card at an ATM. It's no accident so many of us are struggling with debt. And for a lot of people, it's not even about the game being rigged. It's the whole arcade.
Working at the credit card industry, I had a really good perspective of how it worked from the inside, but I didn't feel like I understood really why consumers chose to borrow money. And ultimately, I was really craving to understand were credit cards making people's lives better or not.
In pop culture, they're associated with luxury, freedom,
Give me his credit card.
and frivolous spending.
Max! $200 on Marc Jacobs underwear. Oh, underwear is a basic human right.
But the reality is often the opposite.
I think most of the people I talked to, they didn't feel that they had used their credit card for extravagant things. People were using it for things that were kind of like simple, everyday expenses.
That may be why credit card debt carries a special stigma. One study found that people accurately reported their mortgages, but claimed their credit card debt was 40% less than it actually was.
Most people pay back their debts most of the time until they have a crisis. And so suddenly you're out of a job or you get sick and you turn to your credit card to make up that difference.
It's no secret that few of us have savings accounts. We couldn't come up with a few $100s in a pinch if we had to.
It's $400. 30% of Americans can't cover a $400 emergency expense.
We couldn't come up with a few $100s in a pinch if we had to.
It's $400. 30% of Americans can't cover a $400 emergency expense.
And so our next best thing is credit. A lot of us use credit cards as savings accounts, as the break open
expense.
And so our next best thing is credit. A lot of us use credit cards as savings accounts, as the break open in an emergency. And that's a very expensive way to pay for your problems. Expensive way to pay for your problems.
And this is the real difference between the American system and that of any other industrialized country. That when people are in crisis, we ask them to fend for themselves and to do it on their plastic.
During the 2009 financial crisis, the U.S. passed a law that banned many of the industry's worst practices.
We also put a stop to retroactive rate hikes that appear on a bill suddenly with no rhyme or reason.
That act did drastically reduce the amount of certain fees we had to pay. By one estimate, saving Americans $12.6 billion per year.
But I think what you've seen every year since that law has passed is the CARD Act really moved credit card companies from a model that was actually more fee-driven to a model that was more interest-driven.
Absolutely, there is a fantastical message around credit cards.
That'll be a charge.
That it's going to be this tool to get you to a better place in life, to build your dreams, to get you to a better future. It's not wrong, but it does require following some important rules.
Don't let the card pick you. Find the one that's best for your needs with the lowest interest rate you can get.
You can start with the simple things. Know when your credit card statements are due. Know what your credit score is. Focus on those small things and you'll find yourself actually able to reap a lot more benefits than you ever would have imagined.
Then use your card like it's cash. You may have heard that revolving can sometimes boost your credit score.
This is one of the biggest myths. I don't know who has started this myth. Let's just set the record straight. It is always best to pay off your balance in full every month, period.
I use my cards pretty much like a debit card. I will never carry a balance on it, even if it has a 0% APR promotion.
But if you find yourself in debt, there are things you can do to help climb your way out. Start by taking it one level at a time.
We have a hard time dealing with and thinking about bigger numbers. We have an easier time thinking about smaller chunks of something.
If you've got $10,000 worth of debt and you want to be out of debt in the next 2 years, that's $5,000 a year. What is that on a monthly basis? What is that on a weekly and daily basis?
Then automate your payments.
Use and leverage tools that make life easy and make life certain.
But if we can automate it and say, okay, every month this much comes out of my checking account, then all I have to do is make one decision.
A credit card is a powerful tool. And in the moments of life when you're down on your luck, it can keep you afloat. But it's also easy to slip up. And that's not a personal failure. It's how the whole game was designed.
At college graduation ceremonies, students are often told that the wait is finally over.
You are moments away from graduating, moments away from beginning your journey through life.
That they're now set up for success, ready for anything.
You are capable of greatness in your profession?
You will be ready for work no matter what that work may be.
You are prepared to play the game of life.
The game of life.
The game of life.
In the actual game of life, a classic board game, the very first decision players make is whether or not to go to college. To pay for it, you have to take out a loan, but that's fine. Your degree gets you a higher paying job, you pay off your debts, no problem, and you buy a house, get married, and fill your minivan with kids. That's how it works in the game, and for some people in the real world too. But for others, it doesn't go so smoothly or so quickly. Student loans can set you up on a path of disappointment and dead ends.
It's supposed to be a good decision. They think they're signing up for opportunity, but in so many ways, they're just signing up for debt.
One day, I logged in to check my student loan balance. I clicked record and kind of captured the reaction I had.
I started with $80,000. I have been paying for 10 years. The grand total is I have paid $120,000 and I still owe $76,000. How the is this possible?
There's now more than $1.7 trillion of student loan debt, with nearly 45 million Americans getting a student loan bill each month.
Total student debt has tripled in less than 15 years. Americans now owe more in student loans than in auto loans or in credit card debt.
It's a crisis that we have to address.
Why are so many people drowning in student loan debt for years after they graduate? And what can we do about it?
Good education is good business. We cannot meet the complexities.
Thousands of dollars in student loans that they borrowed for a degree that doesn't lead to a job.
If you don't go to college, you might as well get a face tattoo.
I think I might be late to the game learning about this. Student loans are really messed up.
It all started back in 1957, when Earth got an extra moon. That's what the headlines called it, though its Russian name was Sputnik. It was about the size of a beach ball, and it was hurled into space by a Soviet rocket. Anyone with a halfway decent radio could listen to its faint bleating as it raced around the globe. The space race had begun. 2 months later, the US tried to launch their own satellite, with less success. The Soviets were not above trolling their rival superpower. They jokingly asked if the US was interested in receiving aid earmarked for backward nations. President Dwight Eisenhower addressed his nervous constituents.
My fellow citizens, my subject tonight is science in national security. One of our glaring deficiencies is the failure of this country to give high priority to scientific education and to the place of science in our national life.
At the time, less than 8% of Americans had a bachelor's degree, and most of those graduates were white and male. Some went to expensive private schools. Others attended public universities where state funding kept tuition low, but some people still couldn't afford it. The US tried to launch their own
Some straddle
1957. When Earth got an extra moon. That's what the headlines called it, though its Russian name. Later, the US.
One of our glaring deficiencies is priority to scientific life.
And most of those graduates were white.
Citizens.
President Dwight Eisenhower addressed his option because banks weren't. Some went to expensive private schools. Others attended public universities where state funding kept tuition low, but some people still couldn't afford it. Student loans weren't really an option because banks weren't interested in handing out thousands of dollars to teenagers. And so, in the fall of 1958, Eisenhower signed the National Defense Education Act. It created the first federal loan program for students who were good at science, math, or engineering. And who promised not to try and violently overthrow the government. Everyone hoped that these students would one day help the US beat the Soviets in their scientific Cold War. A few years later, President Lyndon Johnson expanded the program by signing the Higher Education Act. The act created a low-interest loan program for everyone to overthrow the government. Johnson expanded the program by signing the Higher Education Act. The act created a low-interest loan program for everyone, not just science nerds, and it provided grants that didn't need to be paid back for low-income students.
This nation can never make a wiser or a more profitable investment anywhere.
And that investment paid off.
This idea of America as the superpower that it is.
It's one small step for man.
All of that begins with a workforce and a society that's highly educated. The federal investment in higher education has opened more doors to more people of color, to the low-income people, to the marginalized people. A highly educated population absolutely benefits everyone.
When more people go to college, there's less crime, less illness, and less dependence on welfare, the kinds of things that cost the government money. More Americans are choosing the college path. A growing share of those students are relying on loans, and the loans themselves are getting bigger and bigger. The result? A country with an enormous pile of student debt. It's easy to lay the blame on the cost of college. It's true that sticker prices have been going up, but most students pay much less. Thanks to financial aid, the real cost of private school has actually stayed flat for the past 20 years. But the yearly cost of public schools, where around 3/4 of bachelor's degrees are earned, has doubled.
A lot of this is the result of the last recession.
States continue to cut funds for higher education.
So as the budgets for states get tighter and tighter, education is one of the first things to go away.
And so when that happened, all of those costs were also shifted onto families.
The federal government's investment in higher education also hasn't kept pace with need. Federal Pell Grants for low-income students used to cover 79% of tuition, room, and board. But now they cover just 29%. More and more people also are going to graduate school, which federal grants don't cover.
And so how do you make that up?
$1 trillion of student loan debt.
The government used to give out roughly equal amounts of grants and loans, but not anymore.
The federal government nationalized the student loans, flooded the market with them, encouraged young people to take them on.
I had managed to get through all my undergraduate without student loans and then took out about $80,000 for law school.
If she had a typical 10-year loan agreement, she'd have to pay all that back plus $31,000 in interest, and her monthly payments would be over $900.
After I graduated, I was not making enough money to pay back my loans, so I put my loans in deferment.
That means she paused her payments, but the interest kept adding up. And in many loan agreements, unpaid interest is added to the total amount owed. So now Holly has to pay even more interest because she's paying interest on her unpaid interest. That extra $31,000 can easily balloon to more than the original loan.
So the plan was, I'll just get out and I'll make a lot of money. Lawyers make a lot of money, right?
College graduates can expect to make $76K a year, but that's an average over their whole careers. It takes 14 years to get there, and at first, they make much less, especially if they graduated in the wake of a recession.
There are a lot of people who have found themselves in an economy where their education isn't really paying off.
The stress and the pressure of having all of that has kept me from making plans for the future.
I honestly thought I was kind of getting ahead of the game a little bit, and come to find out, I'm actually behind everybody now.
You look at this debt and you go, well, I don't know if I can have a family.
It has always felt oppressive. I even sometimes didn't have quite enough to eat.
There certainly is a crisis in the individual lives of millions of people whose prospects have been blighted by the debt they can't get away from.
It is the reason why so many 20-year-olds are living with their parents. It is the reason I never became a homeowner. It's the reason why so many young people are deciding not to start a family.
50 years ago, if you graduated college, you could probably afford to buy a house and raise a couple kids. And while the wages of college grads have gone up since then, housing and childcare costs have risen faster. Add on student loan payments, and this life could slip out of reach. People who don't go to college might avoid debt. They can end up in worse shape. 50 years ago, they could also afford a house and a couple kids, but today, that's much harder. Their wages are actually lower now.
The bottom has fallen out on non-college educated workers.
So you have to go to college in this economy. But the only way you can pay for it is loans. Is that a choice? No, it's not a real choice. It's a false choice.
Colleges are in a pretty sweet position. They have this essential product, and they can set whatever price they want, knowing that people can take out loans to pay it. Plus, they don't face many consequences if their graduates don't do well.
If you were trying to design a system to cost too much, it would look pretty much like the higher ed environment that we've operated on.
And one particular type of school has definitely taken advantage of this environment: for-profit colleges.
I went to one of them right out of high school.
These types of schools need to make money to please their shareholders, and so they tend to spend less on instruction and more on advertising and recruitment.
There was a commercial's probably still on. It was like one day, one night, Saturday's all right. As a mother of 2 young children who's working 2 or 3 jobs, the thing that I was interested in was obviously getting an education, but trying to figure out how to manage it all.
And for-profit colleges target exactly that kind of person.
What if you could earn your bachelor's or master's degree from a leading accredited university while you're at home?
It worked around my schedule. Financial process is easy.
They'll work with you after work, or you can go before work. It's easy.
The recruiter, he just like ran me down. Like, hey, what are you looking to do? And so I'm like, okay, I want to do video game design. And it's like, that's perfect. We have video games. Like, no matter what I said, everything I said was perfect. So like, they seem to really want me to be here. And I wanted to go somewhere where people wanted me to be.
These are institutions that target really vulnerable populations.
People who feel like they've been left out of traditional higher ed.
They target low-income people.
I was a cashier.
I was doing construction.
Working parents.
A single mom.
A single father.
Veterans.
I did 3 tours in Iraq.
And they present this package of a great job or a great future.
And they even helped us get this great job.
He kind of went on in detail about how they will help me get a job within the video game industry, that they have a 100% job placement rate. But come to find out, that wasn't it at all. I didn't learn video games at all.
Less than 8% of borrowers will go to a for-profit school, but they represent nearly 30% of all student loan defaults.
Defaulting is when you miss multiple loan payments. The default rate is actually the lowest for people who owe the most. They tend to have graduate degrees and higher incomes. And it's highest for the people who owe the least. Many of them started the program, often at a for-profit, but weren't able to finish. Altogether, in 2019, about 1 in 10 borrowers was in default. That's millions of people, and that number's expected to grow.
It has long-lasting and drastic implications for your life.
Your credit score tanks, and your entire balance comes due immediately.
The federal government has incredible collection powers. They can garnish your wages. They can garnish your tax returns.
They will garnish your Social Security. And since that, in a few years, is going to be my only income, I can't afford to have that happen.
The federal government can literally collect on your student loans all the way till you're in the grave.
Default rates are also higher for people of color. Almost a third of Black Americans who went to college a decade ago have since gone into default.
Many of them come from families where there hasn't been savings for college like I did. And many of them are having to work to support themselves and their family. When you get into employment, we know that Black people are paid less than their white counterparts for the same job.
One of the most startling statistics I've heard is that Black graduates are actually more likely to default than white dropouts.
The student debt crisis is a civil rights crisis. We see now how student debt drives income inequality, drives racial inequality.
The very folks that the system was intended to help are actually getting the worst outcomes.
We've tried to fix this problem for generations now. New rounds of policymakers come in and tweak the system in different ways. For example, the US now offers income-based repayment plans, where you just pay a percentage of what you earn each month.
If life doesn't work out well, if the student doesn't get a job or the job doesn't pay very much, you pay much less.
But there are several versions of this program now, which is confusing, with different rules, complicated paperwork, and sometimes loan servicers fail to tell borrowers that they even exist.
They would tell you if you knew to ask about it, but they never offered that information. And that caused me for years to go without income-based repayment because I just didn't know it was available.
So call your loan servicer and ask. If it was easier for everyone to use these programs, that would go a long way towards solving this crisis. It works for some other countries, like Australia. At Purdue University in Indiana, where Mitch Daniels is president, they're trying out a kind of privatized version of income-based repayment called
income share agreements. We think of it as earning your way through college after college.
Purdue University and other investors, including wealthy alumni and a hedge fund, make a bet on students, paying their tuition bills now in exchange for a share of their income later.
It shifts all the risk from the student to the investor. And I think that schools of all kinds ought to be at risk somehow if the degrees they're conferring don't enable their graduates to do well in the world.
But critics argue that these programs are just a new, unregulated way for students to go into debt.
Moving to another loan product, especially right now, when we're already in the midst of a student debt crisis, really makes no sense.
The government has tried to regulate colleges, especially for-profit colleges, in other ways. They sent undercover agents to investigate their recruiters, sued a bunch of them for predatory lending, and created a new rule.
The gainful employment rule simply said, you shouldn't be charging more than the graduate can expect to be able to repay back. That simple.
800 vocational programs failed to meet the standard, and 98% of them were at for-profits. Enrollment at for-profit schools, which had surged in the 2000s, started to suffer from all the bad publicity. And then
the previous administration weaponized the regulation against schools it simply didn't like. This administration is committed to pulling back the previous administration's overreach.
With Secretary Betsy DeVos at the helm, Trump's Department of Education scrapped Obama-era regulations.
In recent years, we've seen these common-sense rules being rolled back.
And then the pandemic triggered a new recession, which meant new problems for students and colleges. But not all colleges.
We are seeing across-the-board losses in higher education enrollment. But you know the sector that's growing? The for-profit sector.
Political leaders have been arguing about the state of higher education for decades, and many of them went to college in the 1960s and graduated without any debt. But more and more people in the halls of power do have personal experience with student loans.
As I am paying my student debt off, I'm going to be sending my daughter in less than a year to college.
When I got in the Senate, I still had these student loans. There were months where my loan payments were higher than our mortgage.
I literally made a student loan payment while I was sitting here at this chair.
Today, about 1 in 6 American voters have student debt, and they're waiting to see what the people they elected will do.
The families I've talked to, the individual borrowers, are sitting around watching people point fingers at each other, and they just really want help.
You want to really supercharge the economy? Give me the shot that you give GM and the airline industries and the 1% and all the tax breaks that Amazon and all these other companies get. Give that to the students. and let's see what happens.
Joe Biden is now in the White House.
Does anybody think that 12 years of education is enough in the 21st century to be in the middle class?
We should be thinking about getting a college education in the same way that we think about getting a K through 12 education. That's why I support debt-free and tuition-free college.
That idea has become increasingly mainstream.
There are too many politicians today who support the truly insidious notion of government gift-giving. Make no mistake, it is a socialist takeover of higher education.
Anytime a politician uses the word free, a taxpayer should immediately button their back left pocket.
But one analysis found that while making public universities free for lower-income students would cost tens of billions of dollars, it would actually break even within a decade, thanks to the boost in tax dollars from new graduates. And for people who are already in debt, Biden says he wants to wipe out at least some of it.
Studies have shown that if you cancel student debt, you can put $80 to $100 billion back into the economy every year. You will watch the GDP rise.
Education is for the common good. It is necessary in order for us not just to compete here, but to compete globally.
Any country that out-educates us is going to outcompete us.
The Soviet Union may be gone, but there are new space races and new frontiers of technology and innovation.
It is the obligation of your nation to provide every child born in these borders all the education that they can take if we are to maintain our freedom in a highly competitive world.